"Master," the apprentice said, pointing at the old wall. "That stone there, it's crooked. Let me take it out and set it straight." The master shook his head. "This wall stands because of its flaws. That crooked stone you're looking at has kept its neighbors from crumbling for 100 years. Pull it out, and you won't fix the wall. You'll only build your own tomb from its rubble." Leonid was a cartographer of ruins. Not those made of stone and dust, but the ones that run like invisible cracks through a person's fate. For 40 years, he had lived within a single mistake. A line on a map, thin as a hair, that he had drawn at 23. A single incorrect arc, a tiny deviation in calculations on a forgotten northern ridge, had cost him his career, his respect, and, he believed, his entire future. The map had long been filed away, and no one had ever crossed that ridge. But the error lived on. It was a scar on his name, a crooked stone in the masonry of his self-perception. His apartment was a silent museum of this downfall. The walls were adorned with others' flawless maps. He studied them for hours, almost with reverent awe, scrutinizing the steady hand of others, the clarity of their designs. He saw not land and water, but the triumph of order over chaos, something he himself lacked. His own life felt like a poorly compiled atlas, where all continents were displaced and scales were distorted by a single smudge on the first page. He wasn't living. He was re-verifying the coordinates of his sorrow. One day, while sorting through boxes left by his old teacher, he stumbled upon a small ebony case. Inside, resting on a velvet lining, was a tool he had never seen, an eraser. But it wasn't made of rubber or vinyl. It was carved from something resembling bone or stone, milky white, with an icy, lifeless sheen. It was heavier than it looked, and held a coldness independent of the room's temperature. A long-dormant curiosity stirred within him. He took a pencil and drew a thick, confident line on a sheet of paper. Then he touched it with the strange eraser. What happened was more than mere erasure. The graphite didn't crumble away. It was absorbed into the white surface, vanishing without a trace. But something else vanished too. Leonid blinked, trying to grasp the elusive sensation. He remembered drawing the line just moments ago, yet the memory of the action itself had become faint, faded, like an old photograph. It wasn't just the drawing that disappeared. It was the very fact of its creation. For a week, he circled the object like an animal around an incomprehensible trap. He tried again and again, drawing symbols, words, entire sentences on paper. The effect was the same. Not only the mark disappeared, but also the weight of the event, its imprint on the world. He erased his mother's name from a piece of paper, and for a moment her image in his memory blurred, becoming foreign and distant until he willed it back into place. Cold dread mingled with an unthinkable, sacrilegious rapture. This tool didn't correct, it expunged. And then a thought previously hidden in the darkest corners of his mind emerged into the light. It was simple and monstrous, the map, that very map. He retrieved the yellowed parchment from its tube, smelling of dust and humiliation. There it was, that line. A crooked nail piercing the flesh of his youth. How many nights had he spent staring at it, mentally straightening its curve, recalculating angles, begging the past for mercy? His hands trembled. "It's madness," his reason whispered. "It's paper, ink. You won't change anything." But another, older and hungrier part of his being replied, "It's not paper, it's your life, and it is imperfect." He locked the door, drawing all the curtains. The room plunged into a gloom where dust motes dancing in a beam of light seemed like stars in a dead universe. He spread the map on the table, smoothing out its creases. There it was, his fate, drawn in ink. He thought of the master and the apprentice. What a foolish parable. Why tolerate a mistake if it could be eliminated? The wall should be straight. The world should be perfect. This wasn't pride. It was the restoration of justice. It wasn't fixing the world, merely correcting a blueprint. With these thoughts, which no longer felt entirely his own, he took the white eraser. A chill ran from his hand all the way to his shoulder. He held it poised above the map. For a moment it seemed to him that all the lines on the parchment, rivers, borders, meridians, trembled like a spider web about to be touched. He squeezed his eyes shut and drew the eraser across the cursed curve. There was no sound, no flash. Just for a fraction of a second, the parchment beneath his fingers felt alive and warm, then grew cold again. He opened his eyes. The line was perfectly straight, flawless, just as it should have always been. A wave of pure, unadulterated euphoria washed over him. He had won. He had removed the crooked stone. He laughed, softly at first, then louder. And in that laughter were 40 years of suppressed pain. He walked to the bookshelf, found an old encyclopedia, and opened it to the article about himself. Previously, it had contained a dry mention of an unfortunate inaccuracy that prematurely ended a promising career. Now those words were gone. The article was shorter, featureless. It stated that cartographer Leonid Verisayev, after several minor works, had left state service and dedicated himself to private practice. The error was gone. But with it, the reason for his notoriety, however shameful, also vanished. The drama was gone. His life was no longer a tragedy. It had become simply nothing. Leonid stood in the middle of the room, and it seemed to him that the walls had grown thinner, and beyond them was not other apartments, not the city, but a gray, silent void. He had fixed the wall, but he hadn't noticed it slowly, soundlessly, beginning to settle around him. The emptiness demanded to be filled. Having rid himself of his own tragedy, Leonid discovered that it was precisely this tragedy that had constituted the entire volume of his soul. Now, in its place, was a vacuum that absorbed light, warmth, and meaning. For days, he sat in his sterile apartment, listening to a silence that had grown thick as felt. Before, he had been a man with a scar. Now, he was a man without a face. This new flawlessness was unbearable. And then a new thought arose within him, cold and clear as a scalpel's edge. If his life had become nothing, it was only because someone else's life had become something more. He remembered his longtime colleague and rival, Igor Strakov. It was Strakov who had led that very expedition after Leonid's failure. Strakov hadn't found the error, but he had meticulously documented its consequences, building his career on that report. His name appeared frequently in geographical journals. He received grants, and his maps hung in offices where Leonid was denied entry. Strakov's success was a direct consequence of Leonid's failure. He was a plant grown on Leonid's grave. Previously, Leonid had accepted this as part of his bitter fate, but now fate had been rewritten. His error no longer existed, which meant Strakov's triumph, built upon it, had become a lie. It had become a crooked stone in someone else's undeservedly straight wall. This wasn't envy, Leonid convinced himself, pacing the room like a caged animal. It was a desire for harmony. The world was unbalanced. He merely wanted to restore equilibrium. In an old atlas, he found one of Strakov's most famous maps, a map of the Arctic shelf for which Strakov had received a state prize. It was perfect. Clear isobaths, precisely charted currents, an impeccable coordinate grid. Leonid looked at it not as a cartographer, but as a surgeon examining a healthy body in which he intended to find a hidden flaw. His gaze settled on a small, unnamed underwater plateau, an unremarkable section of the seabed. He took out his white eraser again. This time, his hand didn't tremble. It held the firmness of an executioner carrying out what he believed was a just sentence. He wasn't going to erase something entirely. That would be crude. He only wanted to make a tiny, imperceptible correction. He touched the eraser to a single digit in the depth notation of that plateau, changing it by just a few dozen meters. Just a light touch, almost a caress. He wasn't destroying someone else's work. He was introducing into it doubt. At that very second, something changed outside the window. Not in the landscape, but in the very quality of the light. It grew dimmer, as if the thinnest gray veil had been drawn between the world and the sun. Leonid walked to the window. Down on the street, people walked as usual, but a barely perceptible uncertainty had entered their movements, as if each of them feared stumbling on flat ground. He waited 3 days. On the 4th, a brief report, lost amidst weather forecasts and currency exchange rates, aired on the news. The research vessel, Polyarctic, conducting drilling on the Arctic shelf, had encountered an unregistered geological anomaly. Their calculations, based on Professor Strakov's maps, proved incorrect. Costly equipment was irrevocably lost. No one was injured, but Strakov's reputation, that seemingly unshakable monolith, had developed its first crack. Leonid turned off the television. Silence once again reigned in the room. But it was a different kind of silence now. It wasn't empty. It was filled with his power, his will. He looked at his hands. Hands that had just, without leaving the room, drowned another's glory in icy water. He felt neither joy nor guilt. Only the cold, metallic satisfaction of a craftsman who had found the right tool for working with the world. He no longer corrected errors in his own wall. He had become the one who decided which stones in others' walls should become crooked. His work expanded. He was no longer a cartographer. He had become a restorer of reality. Minor corrections were made with the cold precision of a surgeon removing tumors from a body. A newspaper article about a political scandal, A light touch of the eraser to an archived transcript, and the career of an unscrupulous official didn't end in shameful dismissal, but simply faded quietly through a series of anonymous positions. A famous novel Leonid had always considered overrated, a single erased sentence in the author's drafts, and the very nerve, the ambiguity that had sparked decades of debate, vanished from the book. He neither punished nor pardoned. He brought the world to a common denominator. With each such correction, the world outside his window grew quieter. At first, he attributed it to his imagination, but soon the silence became palpable. The sharp honking of cars, loud laughter from neighboring apartments, and heated arguments of street vendors disappeared. People moved smoothly, their faces lost their sharp contours, their voices became more even. The world was shedding its extremes. Not only tragedies disappeared, but also great impulses. Not only ugly mistakes vanished, but also brilliant insights that always bordered on madness. Reality under his hand became smooth, gray, and predictable. It was transforming into a flawlessly compiled map of a landscape with no features at all. He realized that all his efforts were merely a fight against symptoms. He was removing crooked stones one by one, but the very nature of the masonry was flawed. The main error wasn't in individual lines, but in the hand that drew them, in the very freedom of that hand to tremble, to err, to choose the wrong path. And one night in his sterile, soundless apartment, he found what he considered the root cause of all chaos. It wasn't a blueprint or a document. It was an old book. A philosophical treatise on the nature of human will. He found a chapter titled The Gift of Doubt. He held the eraser over it. This was his final, greatest correction. He wasn't erasing a word or a phrase. He was expunging from the very foundation of creation the possibility of deviation from the single correct path. When he lifted his head, nothing had changed. But when he looked out the window, he saw the ultimate triumph of his design. Below, people moved. Their movements were perfect and synchronized, like a clockwork mechanism. They didn't collide, nor did they rush or linger. They simply performed their functions. There was no joy, no sorrow, no love, no hatred. There was only order. Absolute, eternal, unbreakable order. He had created a world without a single error. He was the only one who remembered another world. The only one who carried within him the memory of crooked stones, of a casual smile, a bitter tear, a senseless feat, a beautiful mistake. He had become the god of this millimeter-perfect world. But his only divine ability was the awareness of what he had destroyed. He was condemned to wander forever through the streets of his perfect creation, the only living being in a flawless tomb. "Master," the apprentice said, "the wall is straight. It's perfect." The master was silent for a long time, gazing at the monolithic smoothness. "Yes," he finally replied. "Now it is useless to everyone, for a wall only has meaning when there is something it protects against. And in a world where nothing is crooked, straight lines are no longer needed."